Hello, philosopher friends. How's it going? All right, here we are, Virginia Held. Her article is called Feminist Transformations of Moral Theory. Feminist Transformations of Moral Theory. So even if we just think about the title of the article, it is evident, first of all, that we're talking about something from a feminist perspective, whatever that means, right? But is a feminist transformation of moral theory. Held is similar to Code, curious about how philosophy, in Held's case, specifically moral philosophy or moral theory, how philosophy, moral theory, could be different, would be different if approached from a feminist perspective, which doesn't necessarily mean a female's perspective, but it means approached from the perspective that is considered female, right? We've separated in this world, we've separated almost everything by gender. We've separated color by gender, girls pink, boys blue. We've separated professions by gender, more so previously, even to some extent now, police officers and firefighters and those kinds of things are more typically men. We've separated beverages by gender. Women drink, peach daiquiris and, strawberry margaritas or something like that, and men drink, scotch and beer. We've separated toys by gender, trucks and dolls. So everything is separated by gender. We've also separated characteristics or emotions or ways of being by gender, right? Boys are strong and tough and rational. Girls are gentle and delicate and emotional, right? I'm not maybe giving the best examples, but I think you understand what I'm saying, just to the sense that by calling it feminist, it doesn't mean it has to be woman, but I think it does mean it is associated with characteristics or attributes that are typically considered female, which for Held, she's specifically interested in the contrast between what's typically considered male rationality on the one hand and female emotions on the other hand. So, Held begins, like Code, by saying, look, the history of philosophy has been men for 2,000 years. The history of philosophy, including the history of ethics, has been constructed from male points of view and has been built on assumptions and conceptions that are by no means gender neutral. Not gender neutral, not race neutral, not socioeconomically class neutral, right? Philosophy for 2,000 years was basically done by wealthy white men. So how would it be different if it had other people included in the conversation? In this particular article, Held is curious how it would be different if it included attributes typically associated to women, specifically emotions. What role do emotions play, and considerations related to emotion? What role do they play in ethical theory? So, she talks in this first section called The History of Ethics about the emphasis that has been placed on reason over emotion historically. The man of reason, you can go all the way as far back to Plato and Aristotle, where they talk about the advocacy of reason controlling unruly emotions, rationality guiding responsible human action against the blindness of passion. Right? There's no question there has been an emphasis on reason being paramount to making good, sound decisions, including moral decisions. So that is what she is curious about. She then goes on in this paragraph on the second page to talk about the identification of reason with maleness and of the irrationality with the female. So she is wondering how things would be different if we considered the role of emotions and other things associated to that, if we considered these things when making ethical decisions. She then gives us two specific examples about Kant and Mill. Oh, we read Kant and Mill. So both Kant and Mill, Held suggests, who are two of the most fundamental philosophical moral theories in history, in the history of philosophy. Both of these theories are fundamentally suggesting that rational, objective moral principles should be the basis of our moral theory. It's very easy to see in the Kant, where he suggests the categorical imperative. How do we decide what kind of moral action to perform? Well, we apply the categorical imperative, which asks us to universalize the maxim of our action and decide if it can become a universal law. I mean, it doesn't get much more objective than that. You're not allowed to talk about the specifics. You're not allowed to talk about who's doing it, in what situation, what the results of it might be. We're not allowed to think about any of that. We are allowed simply to universalize the maxim of our action. No emotion at all. No consideration for the effects of this action in an emotional sense, right? I'm never allowed to lie because of the categorical imperative. That means truth must be told, right? Even in the instance when the Nazis come to the door, right? Anne Frank, right? Anne Frank is hiding in the attic, and the Nazis come to the door. Do you have any Jews here? Oh, yeah, they're upstairs. They're hiding in the attic, actually, behind the bookcase door, because I can't lie. It would be a violation of the categorical imperative. That seems ludicrous that lying in that instance would be immoral. It would be, according to Kant. And it's problematic to me. Okay, what about Mill? Well, Mill talks about happiness, so that seems an improvement. Happiness is an emotion, but the way I'm supposed to think about happiness is in this objective way. How do I decide what moral action to perform? Well, I need to apply the principle of utility. And the principle of utility states that actions are right insofar as they increase happiness and wrong insofar as they decrease happiness. I mean, it's still a very rational, I'm not acting in an emotional way when I'm a utilitarian. I'm calculating which action would increase happiness for the greatest number of people. It is still a rational, fundamental enterprise. So hopefully it's obvious how both Mill and Kant's theory completely rely on reason and rationality as the fundamental basis upon which moral decisions are made. So what Held wants to know is how else could we do it? So she talks now, this is on the fourth page, she says, many feminist philosophers have questioned whether the reliance on abstract rules rather than the adoption of more context-respectful approaches can possibly be adequate for dealing with moral problems, especially as women experience them. So it's interesting to think about how women experience moral problems differently than men. What do they consider that might be different from men? And someone who's very famous for studying this is a woman by the name of Carol Gilligan, who was working with a sociologist named Kohlberg, and traveled around and studied how women respond to moral questions and how men respond to moral questions and how the ways in which they respond are different. So, women were asked a specific moral question, a scenario, which you're actually guys are going to look at for one of the after you read questions this week. Gilligan took Kohlberg's question and asked women, and took Kohlberg's question and asked men, and found that women and men answered this question in a markedly different way. Even if they didn't come upon a fundamentally different answer, the way they got to that answer was fundamentally different. So, now, this might be because of the way these people were raised, right? Men and women might be different from nature, or perhaps men and women are different because of nurture, right? Because of the way in which we were raised. But the bottom line is, Gilligan did notice a difference, based on the data she collected. She did notice, scientifically speaking, a difference between the way men and women approached moral dilemmas, moral questions. And so what Held is talking about is what are some of the things that women considered when considering moral questions. And so this is what she talks about here, where she talks about women's experience of moral problems seems to be especially concerned with actual relationships between embodied persons and with what these relationships seem to require. Women are often inclined to attend to, rather than to dismiss, the particularities of the context in which a moral problem arises, and we often pay attention to feelings of empathy and caring to suggest what we ought to do, rather than relying as fully as possible on abstract rules of reason. So these are some of the ways in which Gilligan and Held are suggesting that women approach moral questions. So if 2,000 years of philosophy was done by men, and if what that produced was largely ethical theories founded on rationality, objectivity, impartiality, not context-based, not concerned about relationships, not concerned about specificities of situations, are those things that we should consider? What role do those kinds of things have in making moral decisions? And would moral decisions be better if we applied not just rationality to our decisions? So something that I think that's interesting for us to think about is not just how rationality is given priority or value. Rationality is not just given priority or value over emotions in ethical decisions. I think rationality is given priority over emotions in almost all decisions. So really, I see this as an invitation for each of us to consult our own psyche, our own consciousness, and consider within ourselves, how do we balance rationality and emotion? Rationality and concern about relationships, rationality and specificity of situations. Do we believe that, being objective, being impartial, should I treat every single student exactly the same, regardless of the situation? Is that what's fair? Or do specificities of things matter? Do circumstances affect things? Are there abstract, objective moral rules that should be followed without consulting anything but the rule? Or is life a heck of a lot more complicated than that, and it's a dance between thinking about notions of right and wrong, principles, but also relationships, also how it feels, what it does. So this is stuff that feminist approaches to ethics look at. We'll just look here at this last page. She says, in any case, feminist philosophers are in the process of reevaluating the place of emotion in morality in at least two respects. First, many think morality requires the development of the moral emotions, right? There is something, right? I don't know if you guys grew up talking about an emotional IQ, right? So realizing that having empathy is a mature thing to be able to have, right? And then second, she says, emotion will be respected rather than dismissed by many feminist moral philosophers. So really prior to women entering the conversation, feminist philosophers entering the conversation, emotion was like two thumbs down on emotion. We were not allowed to consider or discuss or consult our emotion. Is that the best way to make a moral decision? She's suggesting we consider not. Finally, here at the end, she says, a feminist ethic will not just acknowledge emotion, as a utilitarian does, it will embrace emotion, providing at least a partial basis for morality itself and for moral understanding. And then this last paragraph, achieving and maintaining trusting, caring relationships is quite different from acting in accord with rational principles. Achieving and maintaining trusting, caring relationships is quite different from acting in accord with rational principles. Just think about the difference in a world in which, instead of what's most important being rational moral principles, is achieving and maintaining healthy relationships. It's just like, whoa, it changes entirely how things are. It's like a paradigm shift, right? It seems dramatically different to me. Okay, so this is just a bit of a taste of feminist ethical theory. We do have a class here. I don't think I told you guys. It's Philosophy 129. It's a class where we look at philosophical issues and talk about them. So we've mentioned gender, right? We talked about gender a little bit when we talked about epistemology, when we read the Lorraine Code. We talked about gender when we read the Barthes and the Beauvoir, and now we're talking about gender again. There are other things to consider too, like race, like socioeconomic status, right? Philosophy was produced for 2,000 years by white men. There are a lot of people who weren't involved in that conversation, and the world may or may not look different, philosophically speaking, and so we're just sort of throwing out here maybe one of the ways in which it might be different. I'm curious what you think. As always, you can call me or email me or come by my office and say hello. I'd love to talk. I hope you guys are doing well. I'll talk to you soon.